480 kilometers. That is how much Ukrainian territory Ukraine has liberated from Russia in a single sector alone during the first months of 2026. 480 kilometers. In the same month that Russia launched its Grand Spring Offensive, the one that was supposed to finally break Ukraine, Putin's forces recorded zero net territorial gains for the first time in 2.5 years. None. And as Russia bled out over 35,000 soldiers in March alone, a new record for the entire war, Ukraine's forces were pushing deeper into territory that the Kremlin had spent 4 months and thousands of lives to take. This is not a story about Ukraine surviving. Ukraine has long since moved past surviving. This is a story about Ukraine winning, about a nation that transformed itself under fire into one of the most formidable military powers on Earth, and about what happens when the country that was supposed to collapse decides instead to counterattack. In this video, we will look at exactly how Ukraine's de-Russification campaign broke Russia's spring offensive before it could begin, how the loss of a single communications network unraveled 4 months of Russian infiltration in 3 weeks, how Ukraine's drone revolution is rewriting the rules of 21st century warfare and making the country indispensable to allies from the Gulf to Africa, and what all of this means for Putin's much-announced victory that is now very plainly not coming. But first, let us look at the gray zones where all of this began. Russia had a plan. It always has a plan. In the latter half of 2025, that plan was built around something that military analysts call area denial through infiltration. Small units, ghost teams. Soldiers slipped quietly behind Ukrainian lines, burrowing into the rubble of half-destroyed villages, digging in and waiting. The idea was simple, and for a time, effective. Russia did not need to hold territory cleanly. It only needed to make the battlefield murky enough that it could claim propaganda victories. Gray zones. Regions where neither side had full control, where the fog of war was thick enough to let Putin stand before cameras and declare that his armies were advancing. These gray zones stretched across roughly 30 kilometers of southeastern Ukraine, from the Ukrainian-controlled settlement of Petrovska in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast to the Russian-held town of Huliai-Pole in Zaporizhia. For months, Russia's infiltrators embedded themselves in the shattered remains of small settlements, using the ruins as cover, waiting for backup that rarely came. The chaos served a purpose. Every murky corner of the map was another place where Russia could point and say, "Ours." Russia spent 4 months building this. 4 months of infiltration, of slow poisoning, of Russification in the shadows. Then Ukraine moved. Think about what that means. 4 months of careful, patient, costly Russian infiltration, erased in 3 weeks. But that reversal did not happen in isolation. It happened because something broke, something that Russia had been quietly depending on and that nobody in Moscow had planned to lose. Here is where it gets serious. In late January of 2026, SpaceX made a decision. The illicit Starlink terminals that Russia had been smuggling to its soldiers across the 700-mile front line, using them to coordinate assaults, direct drone strikes, maintain command, were shut down. SpaceX created a whitelist for Ukrainian terminals that simultaneously functioned as an automatic blacklist for every terminal Russia had been using without authorization. In an instant, Russian command centers lost the ability to talk to their forward units. Infiltrators, who had been dug into Ukrainian territory for weeks, lost contact with everything. No coordinates, no reinforcements, no information. And then Putin made it worse. Within days of the Starlink shutdown, Russia's president decided to restrict access to Telegram on the front lines, the one communication channel that might have partially filled the gap. In his desire to control the flow of information, Putin silenced the very soldiers who needed to communicate most. If you are looking for a metaphor, it is as if a ship captain, having just lost radar, decided to also cover all the portholes. Russia's southeastern front collapsed, not from a frontal assault, not from a massive Ukrainian armored push. It collapsed from within, because its nervous system had been severed. Ukraine was ready. Search and destroy squads fanned out into the gray zones. The isolated Russian infiltrators, cut off, confused, unable to call for help, were picked off. The fog that Russia had spent 4 months manufacturing was burned away. And once the gray zones were clear, Ukraine did not stop. It pushed, until now. The village of Tanova fell first, population a little over 300 before the war reduced it to rubble. It sits in Dnipropetrovsk, close to the borders of both Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Small, strategically unremarkable to most observers. But on February 21st, units from the 2nd Battalion of Ukraine's 425th Assault Regiment pushed into Tanova and drove out the entrenched soldiers of Russia's 69th Covering Brigade in record time. No prolonged siege, no grinding attrition. The Russians were already in disarray. Ukraine simply arrived and finished the job. Tanova was a signal, not just a village liberated, a signal that the gray zone clearing operation had evolved into something larger, a de-Russification campaign, a deliberate systematic expulsion of Russian presence from Ukraine's southeast. Within days, the list of liberated settlements grew. Risna, Andriivka, Nachayka, Ostapivka, Novozaporizhia, 8 settlements in flash assaults that Russia could not stop. French military analyst Clement Milan, mapping the situation on February 21st using satellite imagery and shelling data, confirmed what the maps were already showing. Ukraine had regained control of most of the defensive line it had held in that sector back in 2022. Anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, dragon's teeth, all back in Ukrainian hands. The foundations for fortifications that will blunt Russia's next push before it begins. Milan put it plainly. Russia lost in 3 weeks at least 4 months of infiltrations far behind the lines. And more, he said, was coming. By the time Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky reported on February 23rd, Ukraine had liberated approximately 400 square kilometers of territory. 400 square kilometers in 3 weeks. But that is only half the story. The de-Russification campaign was never purely military. It was always something deeper. Ukraine has been trying to rid itself of Russian influence long before the full-scale invasion began. The Maidan Revolution of 2014 set the process in motion. The years that followed saw Ukraine consolidate its sovereignty in education, language, media, and religion. In 2019 alone, Ukraine restored the independence of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine from Moscow and passed legislation mandating the use of the Ukrainian language in all public education, media, and administration. Every one of these decisions sent a shockwave through the Kremlin. Putin could feel the gravity of his influence fading. That, many argue, is precisely why he invaded. But all that Putin actually achieved was to accelerate the very process he was trying to stop. Every settlement Ukraine liberates is a statement. Every scrap of Russian infrastructure, propaganda, currency, language policy that Ukraine dismantles is another message back to Moscow. In October 2025, Ukraine's national bank chief made the case for eliminating the kopek, a piece of Russian currency still circulating in Ukraine. He described it as a piece of Moscow that remains in our pockets, on our price tags, and in our heads. That is what de-Russification looks like from the inside. And on the battlefield, it looks like this. 8 settlements liberated, 4 months of Russian gains reversed, and a counteroffensive that set the stage for everything that followed. Stay with us, because it gets worse for Russia from here. Kupiansk came first. Russia had been claiming the city in Kharkiv Oblast for weeks. Bold proclamations from the Kremlin that Ukraine had lost another city, that Putin's forces were unstoppable. Ukraine responded not with words, but with operations. By December 1st, Ukraine held 90% of the city. By December 25th, it had liberated at least 183 square kilometers in the Kupiansk direction. Russia's narrative shattered before the new year even began. But Kupiansk was a preview. The main event was further south. With the gray zones cleared and Russia's infiltrators being steadily eliminated, Ukraine launched what can only be described as a systematic dismantling of everything Russia had built in the southeast throughout 2025. The intelligence picture that Ukraine's Delta system, a cloud-based battlefield management tool pulling real-time data from drones and ground units across the entire front, was delivering, gave Ukraine's commanders a precise map of where Russia was weakest. And Ukraine struck exactly there. This is the philosophy that Ukraine's military leadership has named active defense. It is not the passive posture the phrase might suggest. It is the deliberate choice to attack wherever Russia is overextended, force Russia to move troops in response, create new weaknesses elsewhere, and attack those too. General Syrskyi described it directly. Ukraine is forcing Russia to play by Ukraine's rules. The results speak in numbers. By the end of March, Ukraine had liberated over 480 square kilometers in the Orikhiv sector alone. Another 430 square kilometers in the earlier Dorilia counteroffensive. Kupiansk adding at least another 183. All told, Ukraine has reclaimed more of its territory in the first quarter of 2026 than at any point since the 2023 counteroffensive. And unlike that 2023 effort, which spread Ukraine's forces too thin across too many fronts and ultimately stalled, this campaign is different. Surgical, sector by sector, targeted against precisely the places where Russia's hold is weakest. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War said it claimly. This is not accidental, it is not circumstantial, there are reasons for it. And then Ukraine made its move on the casualties. 35,351. That is the number of Russian soldiers killed or wounded in March 2026 alone. A new monthly record, a 29% increase over February's already devastating figures. And here's the detail that reframes everything. 96% of those casualties were caused by drones. 96%. Ukraine's drone revolution is not a battlefield innovation anymore. It is the battlefield. Ukraine is now producing approximately 1,500 interceptor drones per day, a monthly output of around 45,000, in addition to the millions of first-person view combat drones flooding its kill zones. The United Kingdom alone is sending over 120,000 additional drones to Ukraine in 2026, adding to the domestic production that Ukraine has scaled to a level that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. But the number that most devastates Putin's narrative is this. March 2026 was the first month in the entire war where Ukraine launched more long-range drones at Russia than Russia launched at Ukraine. 7,347 Ukrainian drones versus 6,462 Russian ones. Ukraine threw 885 more deep strike drones at Russian territory in a single month than Russia managed to send at Ukraine. 237 unmanned systems striking inside Russia every single day. And Ukraine's new interceptor drones, tiny, cheap, kinetic, achieved a near 90% interception rate against Russia's incoming Shahed strikes in March. Russia is launching fewer drones than Ukraine. Russia is losing more of its drones than Ukraine. Russia is taking more strikes to its territory than Ukraine. In 1 month, Russia's clear, long-standing advantage in long-range drone warfare was eliminated. So why does this matter beyond the numbers? Because of what Ukraine hit. Inside Russia alone, 76 targets were struck in March, including 15 facilities tied to oil refining. Ukraine's strikes on Baltic seaports took 40% of Russia's crude oil export capacity offline in a single campaign. Russia's war machine runs on oil revenue. When those refineries burn and those port terminals shut down, the money that flows into the Kremlin war chest shrinks. Fewer funds means fewer weapons procured, fewer contracts signed, fewer soldiers hired. Ukraine is not just fighting Russia on the front line. It is dismantling Russia's ability to fight the war from the inside out. Here is what that actually costs Russia, not in one battle, but compounded across months. Russia entered 2026 planning to recruit 409,000 soldiers by year's end. It is nowhere near that pace. The current daily recruitment average of 1,120 soldiers produces a projected shortfall of 65,000 fighters against its own target. Meanwhile, Russia is losing soldiers faster than any other point in the war. The math is simple, and it is brutal. Russia is hemorrhaging faster than it can replace, and that feeds directly into what comes next. Russia's plan for 2026 was ambitious. Take the fortress belt in Donetsk, the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, advance to the left bank of the Dnipro River, consolidate the Black Sea coast, complete the capture of Luhansk, create buffer zones in Sumy and Zaporizhia to protect the main eastern offensive. Take Zaporizhia City and Orikhiv as supporting attacks, and do it all by the end of the year. Putin told his generals these were not aspirations, they were deadlines. Then the spring offensive launched in March, and within weeks, the Kremlin had already begun quietly pushing back its own goals. The buffer zone in Sumy postponed to the second half of 2026, possibly 2027. The objectives in Kharkiv shelved, the Black Sea coast consolidation shelved, and replacing the grand mechanized push that Putin had envisioned, the same infiltration tactics that Russia has been trying since 2025. The same small unit insertions into gray zones, the same tactic that Ukraine has now demonstrated it can dismantle in 3 weeks. Russian military bloggers, the Kremlin's own unofficial commentators, are losing their minds over this. The Institute for the Study of War reported in late March that these bloggers are demanding a wholesale reformation of Russia's force structure, a complete abandonment of the infiltration approach in favor of larger mechanized assaults. One blogger estimated that at the current rate of advance, Russia would take approximately 100 years to seize the rest of Ukraine. The ISW's own assessment puts the figure at 83 years, based on Russia's pace of advance from February 2025. 83 years. That is how close Russia is to the inevitable victory that Putin has been promising since February 2022. The hard numbers confirm what the bloggers can feel. The Institute for the Study of War compared Russia's territorial gains in the 6 months between October 2025 and March 2026 with the same period a year earlier. A year ago, Russia seized the equivalent of almost 1,050 square miles during that stretch, roughly 175 miles per month, about 5¾ miles per day. In the most recent 6-month window, Russia took roughly 745 square miles, about 124 miles per month, just over 4 miles per day. Russia's rate of advance has fallen by roughly 30% year over year. At the very moment its spring offensive was supposed to accelerate toward total victory. And Ukraine's rate of advance? 4.66 square kilometers per day in March, almost twice Russia's daily gain. For the first time in 2.5 years, March 2026 ended with Russia's net territorial change at 0. Every Russian gain matched and overturned by Ukrainian advances. 35,000 soldiers lost. No ground taken. Think about what that means. Putin had one response to all of this, the only response he has ever had. More troops, more assaults, more cannon fodder pushed into the kill zones that Ukraine has built across the front. In the 4 days between March 17th and March 20th, Russia launched over 600 assaults. 600. The result? 6,090 Russian casualties. An average of 1,520 per day during that stretch. A single day, March 17th, saw 1,710 Russian soldiers fall, the highest single-day figure of 2026. And the fortress belt? Putin set a deadline of April 25th for Russian forces to capture Kostiantynivka, the gateway city. Donetsk itself was supposed to be fully in Russian hands by the end of the year. To put that in context, it took Russia 21 months to achieve any meaningful breakthrough in the far smaller city of Avdiivka. The fortress-built cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk dwarf Avdiivka in size, fortification, and strategic depth. The ISW's verdict is unambiguous. Significant Russian battlefield gains, let alone total victory, are not imminent nor inevitable. That assessment was not written as a prediction. It was written as an observation of what is already happening in real time. And now Russia is doing something that reveals just how desperate the situation has become. A decree signed on March 20th requires Russian businesses with between 150 and 500 employees to nominate between 2 and 5 of their workers for military service contracts. Russia is conscripting from the workplace. This is not the voluntary army that Putin has spent years presenting to his domestic audience as proof that Russians want to fight. This is a state reaching into factories and offices because the stream of volunteers has dried up and the casualty lists keep growing. The spring offensive was supposed to be Russia's closing statement in Ukraine. Instead, it is being written as the chapter where Russia's overreach became impossible to conceal. Here is where the story expands beyond Ukraine's borders. Because what Ukraine has built is not just a military. It is a strategic asset that the world is starting to recognize and compete for. Ukraine's president made an announcement on April 13th, marking Ukrainian Arms Makers Day. For the first time in Ukraine's history, he said, the courage of its warriors and the resilience of its people are sufficiently armed to defend against Russian strikes. This was not a ceremonial statement. It was a declaration of self-sufficiency from a country that 3 years ago needed emergency shipments just to hold the line. On that same day, Ukraine unveiled a portfolio of 56 domestically developed weapon systems, 31 drone variants, 7 missile systems, 4 electronic warfare platforms, 6 robotic ground systems, 4 new armored vehicle designs, 3 unmanned naval systems, a mobile air defense turret. Every one of these systems was built in response to a specific threat that Ukraine faced in the field. The war did not weaken Ukraine's defense industry. It forged it. And now Ukraine is exporting that capability. Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates have signed decade-long defense agreements with Ukraine. They want the interceptors. They want the expertise. Over 200 Ukrainian anti-drone specialists have been deployed directly to the Middle East, not just to train local forces, but to actively participate in the destruction of Russian-made Shahed drones being launched by Iran against Gulf territory. Ukrainian soldiers are now defending the Gulf. In Libya, Ukraine operates a trio of bases that may have been used to strike Russian Shadow Fleet assets in the Mediterranean Sea. In Europe, Ukraine is working with partner nations on ballistic missile countermeasures, positioning itself as the continent's leading laboratory for 21st-century air defense. This is the government-to-government model that Ukraine's leadership describes as its framework for defense diplomacy. Build trust first, then build contracts, then build the relationships that outlast any single conflict. Ukraine is no longer the country asking for help. It is the country others are asking. The United States is already feeling this shift. Operation Epic Fury, the American campaign to enforce a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz following the collapse of the Iran ceasefire, has created a vulnerability that Ukraine is uniquely positioned to address. American warships enforcing a blockade become fixed targets. Fixed targets are vulnerable to Shahed drones. Iran has those drones. Russia gave Iran the production knowledge to build them at scale. Ukraine has spent 3 years developing the exact counters that the United States now needs. Ukraine's interceptor drones cost between $300 and $1,200 to build. The Patriot missiles that the United States has been using to stop incoming Shaheds cost $4 million each. To intercept a drone that costs $20,000 to $50,000 to manufacture. Ukraine's interceptors are up to 66 times cheaper than the cheapest Shahed at the lowest production cost. And the technology is proven at scale in the most drone-saturated battlefield in history. The United States has already been told this. Ukraine's president offered the deal directly in March, interceptors in exchange for Patriot missiles. The offer was declined. But as American warships take position in the Strait of Hormuz, the calculation is changing. The country that once needed the world's help is now ready to provide it. The only barrier is the willingness of Washington to accept. Putin built his trap for a version of the world in which Ukraine was a victim. A world where superior Russian numbers would grind down a smaller, weaker opponent. Where Russian drones would darken Ukrainian skies unopposed. Where gray zones would expand quietly until the map looked like a Russian victory. Where the spring of 2026 would be the closing act of a war that Russia had already effectively won. That world does not exist. Ukraine dismantled it, gray zone by gray zone, settlement by settlement, drone by drone. 35,000 Russian soldiers in a single month, zero net Russian territorial gains, an 83-year projection for Russia to complete its conquest. A de-Russification campaign that reversed 4 months of Russian infiltration in 3 weeks and set the conditions for everything that has followed. Russia launched this war to destroy Ukrainian statehood. Instead, it built the most battle-hardened, innovation-driven, strategically sophisticated military force that Ukraine has ever fielded. And it has made Ukraine indispensable to allies from the Gulf to the Baltic. Putin's spring of victory has become Ukraine's spring of momentum. The war that was supposed to end Ukraine has made it stronger than it has ever been at any point in its history. If you found value in this, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next.